Hello and welcome to Open Dailies. We have a submission today from Ian Carr, who's kind enough to submit his renders for LED light strips. So let's jump straight in. What we have here in Sync Sketch is two renders where we've got, which I'll hit play on the first one. One with the CG renders from the LED light strips, which I'll hit play. That's nice. And then the second is a reference slap, which I will also play. What's really good about having this reference is it removes the subjective from this process. So I should be able to go compare and go to a frame where we've got the real right next to the artificial. This is a great example of formatting that's really useful. I tend to talk about things that are relevant to this submission. This is a lighting slap. And I also, because obviously we don't work in a vacuum, I will occasionally talk about things that are not directly related to the submission, like lookdev or modeling or texturing for the sake of helping the artist. I would say that I looked up the Lucetta branding, I'm not sure how it's pronounced. I looked up that branding and they did have a specific font with a sort of dot in the A there and then a TM here. So if this is meant to reproduce an actual product, texture-wise, we would need to revisit those textures. And again, lookdev as well. These raised sort of copper or foil pieces, to me, suggest an incorrect position compared to in the reference. I'm seeing that as perhaps foil that's inset in the strip and so recessed. So under this sort of plastic housing, I would expect to see the foil below that rather than sort of embossed over the top. That could be incorrect, but that's a perception. Right now, this reads as embossed. But obviously, this is not a modeling submission. This is not a texturing submission. So let's move on to lighting. I'll turn off compare at the moment. I'll talk first about what I like, right? So what I think is successful from a design point of view. Now, that's actually going to be less useful depending on the goal of this. And I think that will become clear later. But for me, this is, you've got a nice compositionally, you've got a nice halo, center spot to sort of reverse vignette and this in front of it. So a nice dynamic background. The lighting is is describing the shape fairly well as we go from close up to wide. You've got some interesting contrast here with the twist. I think that's quite nice, showing how these respond differently, even though we perceive them as the same subject. So just rolling through. Then we've got a contact sheet here of all of them, which is really useful. And then we've got this render. So I think this gets into how my notes can be useful and how they can be not useful. So I could very easily steer this in a specific direction based on what I like, and I don't want to do that because I'm not the client in this case. So if these are intended as product photos on Amazon, or on an online marketplace, let's say, you very often are looking at something where you want that product on a white background. You might have a sort of artificial drop shadow or artificial reflection, which is just placed to give a sense of scale and integrated into the page a little bit more of a design cue than anything else. And what I've done is I've gone to the electronics section because they are a good example of presenting things with different materials statically on a white background where people understand what they're getting. So I'll highlight this webcam, which I am not endorsing this webcam, but this webcam is, we can see the studio style lighting on the aluminum or metallic housing. And again, a sort of looks like an anodized, more blurred response reflection-wise, but it looks as though there's some studio lighting there. And then here in the reflective surface, we see a dark shape with a hard terminator and then a gradient falling off. You would do this practically with a softbox to where you have a diffused light with a hard line, and you would angle it so that the reflection is specifically correct on that surface. So if these are the language, if this is the language of product photography for a surface, then let's go back to our dailies. We are closest in shots like this, but I would say that we're a bit flat in terms of dynamic range, which is a challenge because it's a white surface. You know, with a white surface, too much light and it quickly blows out. But I would say that we're more successful than, let's say, what I believe is already on the exact, the website. I think what we've got in our current submissions is more interesting and better. But this obviously would not sit well over a white background because this would look flat and gray. If the goal is more of a white background product photography style presentation, then I would recommend going more to a slightly higher contrast, more soft lighting where the lights are, letting areas go into shadow where the lights aren't, and trying in the reflective surfaces to get that hard terminator moving through the reflections to illustrate the softbox. So let's go to one that's probably the most like that. So we could see the hard terminator over the white because it looks as though it's a plastic type material. We could angle the lighting strip more, so more of an angle to be able to fit more of it in the frame, and then perhaps get the terminator through these. We can also cheat and have multiple terminators, through those. Now that's assuming that we're going for a product photography presentation. If we're going for more of a promotional, let's jump back to Ian's submission. I think this is more successful on black, dynamic, more of a dynamic lighting scenario, brighter brights, deeper shadows, getting the reflection playing through the copper capsule shapes. And then, some nice flaring. So this is more successful from a dynamic promotional point of view. However, let's look at some of these. These are LED strips, so I'd be curious if we could get a bit of color and if we could get more dynamic shapes into the, bending the material more. And then it becomes a little bit more interesting. I quite like this as well, again, from a promotional point of view. I don't care for this personally from a promotional or from a product photography because it looks messy. Again, we're not talking about lighting with that, but I don't quite like the lighting either. If from a promotional perspective, the LED strips are supposed to vanish, then having a transition from a product photography style image to something like this could be quite successful. And again, this is the environment's not getting in the way. It's got some. The lighting is acceptable, and it's also letting the LED strips do a bit of the job. So this is interesting to me. So I think first step for me is, and not talking about texturing, modeling, or look development, just looking at the lighting itself. The first step is, are we doing a product photo or are we doing a promotional photo or video? And then, or both, in which case, we have different courses of action based on what it is that we're trying to accomplish. So I just transitioned back to Amazon. Brighter brights, contrast between the brights and the darks, different reflection response, looking at it in context on a white background in the correct color space, which I'm assuming is sRGB for web, and making sure that that we both understand the shape of it and that it stands out in a way that describes the surfaces. When I say describe the shape, this is one of the challenges that we run into with 3D lighting is as 3D artists, we know that an object is a square, a cube, cylindrical. And because we know that, putting a HDRI or an area light, and we expect it to behave, and communicate its shape inherently by nature of the fact that it is a cylinder, therefore it should look cylindrical. And what can happen, and we've seen it with the memes, the blue and gold dress, optical illusions with the checkerboard pattern, which I should have had up, that shapes can communicate visually in 2D space based on lighting, or they can miscommunicate shape in 2D space based on lighting. And when that happens in 3D, we can sometimes get into a cul-de-sac where we can't move forward in describing the shape. The goal of lighting is communicating shape. So what can be useful is understanding how two-dimensional shapes are communicated. So as I go to my little whiteboard here, if we imagine a cylinder, a three-dimensional cylinder, and if you'll just pardon my mouse drawing, the way that we communicate that in 2 dimensions using shading, light and shadow, the way that we communicate what that shape is the contrast of light and shadow on a 2-dimensional object. This is sort of more of a football, but we'll go with it. If we then take the same-ish silhouette and we flat light it, we lose the contrast of light and shadow. So this could be an elongated object coming toward us. This can be an elongated, this could be a hole. This could be any number of things, because the compression of the 3rd dimension into 2 dimensions requires light and shadow for us to know what the shape is. Similarly with a cube, the shape of the cube, which side is shadowed, where the light is coming from, in this case here, is communicated on the shading. If we again take the same cube, draw it in silhouette, we don't see a cube. We actually see a hexagon. I had to count. A hexagon. In the same way in 3D, we could very easily create something like this with a HDRI or with an area light. It's actually one of the problems with real photography, flash photography. Just quickly come back. One of the big problems with flash photography has been it's lighting from the same direction as the camera, so you lose shape. The reflectivity of the surface you're photographing will often describe the shape in the specular highlights of a flash photograph, and so you still have the shape. But if you have a perfect diffuse from the perspective of the camera, the roll-off away from the camera is the only shaping. And if you have light coming from everywhere, not just from the camera, then it's impossible to perceive the shape. So the goal of 3D lighting is to understand the 2-dimensional descriptions of simple geometries within the brief. So if a client wants me to light a CG cube, I am not only trying to integrate it into the footage or to match the style of the product photography, but I'm also looking at the cube or square shapes and making sure that the gradients are describing the faces. The shape that we get in the twists is really interesting because you see the geometries change in lighting over the course of the surface. And that gives us a better sense of what exactly it is we're seeing, more so than this. So to summarize, I think in general, we're perceiving the shape well. We're not perceiving the reflectivity as well. And our goal needs to be clearer between promotional content or product photography content or sort of PDF specification content. But really good submissions, really fun, and particularly enjoy the sort of Apple-esque flare into camera. It's really nice. Thanks very much, and hopefully this is helpful. We will see you in the next one.